victor's camp in 285. When his term as governor was up, Constantius was promoted to the position of Praetorian Prefect in the west in 288, where he continued to distinguish himself during the campaigns on the east side of the Rhine in preparation for the invasion of Britain. We don't really know what role Constantius played in the failed invasion of Britain, though as prefect, he had to have been neck-deep in the preparations, and later, he showed very clearly that he had learned from the mistakes that were made in 289 when he initiated his own successful invasion. We also don't really know what long-term dynastic plans were at work when Maximian married his daughter to Constantius that same year. That is, did Constantius marry Theodora because Diocletian already planned to make him a Caesar, or was Constantius made Caesar because he was already married to Theodora? This question hinges on when Diocletian first conceived of the Tetrarchy, which is unfortunately a question we do not have a good answer to. However, we do have a good answer as to when Diocletian probably first broached the subject of further dividing the empire with Maximian, and that would be over the winter of 290-291. By that time, Diocletian had traveled all the way back to Milan to meet with Maximian and shore up the regime after its nasty setback in the north. The two emperors oversaw solemn ceremonies and exuberant games to celebrate their rule, the peace and stability of the empire, and their mutual support for one another. Whatever else you took away from the pageantry, there was no denying that despite the recent failures, Diocletian still stood behind Maximian 100%. Over the course of the winter and the following year, the two men met often, and Diocletian likely laid out his plans for the future and what he expected of Maximian, which is why some surmise that it was at this point that Diocletian revealed his plans to appoint junior colleagues to aid in their massive struggle to secure a bright future for the empire. After the meetings in Milan, Diocletian headed back to his de facto capital in Nicomedia, while Maximian remained in Italy. Where exactly Constantius was at this point is unknown, but he was somewhere in the west, either seeing to things in Gaul or staying in Milan with Maximian. The whereabouts of the fourth member of our eventual Tetrarchy, though, is an even greater mystery. Though Galerius will soon emerge as a formidable force in Roman history, for example, in many ways he wound up being the unwitting author of Rome's Christianization, which is not a small thing at all, his life and career up to this point is shrouded in mist. He was born sometime between 250 and 260, and was probably slightly younger than Constantius, though not by much. Unlike the rest of his colleagues, Galerius also appears to have been born in Thrace, rather than one of the Illyrian provinces proper, and for a time, he followed his father as a herdsman before deciding to join the army, most likely during the reign of Aurelian. He too no doubt established himself as a highly capable soldier, because in just a few years he went from new recruit to high-ranking officer, and like his future colleague Constantius, he was very possibly appointed Praetorian Prefect by the late 280s AD, serving under Diocletian in the east. But beyond this, we know almost nothing about how Galerius managed to distinguish himself from all the other viable candidates when it came time for Diocletian to expand the Imperial College. After much consideration, and with so many of the empire's long-term problems still unresolved, Diocletian made the move to name two more members of the Imperial Brotherhood, and establish what we today refer to as the Tetrarchy. Though, it is important to note that like the first triumvirate, no one called it the Tetrarchy at the time. In simultaneous ceremonies in Sirmium and Milan, the two Augusti each formally elevated a colleague to serve alongside them, Maximian investing Constantius, and Diocletian investing Galerius. To cement the imperial alliance, each new Caesar was married to the daughter of an Augustus, though the timing of these marriages is still a matter of debate. As I said, Constantius appears to have already been married to Theodora, which, if true, may have been the reason why he got the nod in the first place, and it is likely that Galerius, too, was already married to Diocletian's only daughter Valeria when he was elevated to power. Though this is all still up in the air, we know for sure that by 293, each man was the son-in-law of their respective Augusti. Now, as with Maximian's initial elevation, Constantius and Galerius were not made full Augusti, but were instead raised to the rank of Caesar. Though they would outrank every other man in the empire, and would in their own territorial spheres have almost complete autonomy, they were most definitely styled as the junior partners in the equation. Maximian and Diocletian still outranked them, and by virtue of both his seniority and his overpowering gravitas, Diocletian outranked them all. The empire was then roughly divided in fourths, with Constantius taking Gaul and eventually Britain, Maximian in charge of Spain, Africa, and Italy, Galerius taking the Danube provinces, and Diocletian watching the Far East. The split in provinces reflected the relative seniority of the tetrarchs, with Diocletian and Maximian taking the rich and relatively peaceful portions of the empire, while their junior Caesars handled the much rougher regions along the Rhine and Danube frontier. Constantius in particular was given the toughest assignment of all, as it was made clear to him that his entire reason for being, and possibly the whole reason the new tetrarchy existed at all, was that Britain had to be retaken. And retaking Britain, now 7 years gone from Roman control, had proven to be an impossible task up to that point. So, yeah, good luck with that. Now before we go on, I should note that these territorial divisions were in no way officially demarcated political units, and in fact, every chance he got, Diocletian emphasized the unity of the empire. He was sensitive to the fact that Rome had just gone through a traumatic decade and a half, where the empire really was divided from itself, and he was not keen to reopen that still healing wound. So he established a precedent whereby each of the tetrarchs would share in the victories of the others, coin in each other's names, and come and go and shift spheres of influence as the situation dictated. As we'll see, Diocletian and Galerius in particular would flip-flop depending on where the empire's fires were burning brightest. Power was being shared by four men, and for obvious reasons, each established capitals, allowing them to easily manage a different zone. But the empire is still one empire. It is not, Diocletian went to great lengths to express, nor will it ever be, he repeated again and again, four separate empires. Following their respective elevations, the two new Caesars went to work right away. For Constantius, this meant heading north to Trier, where he immediately began to prepare a second invasion of Britain. Galerius, meanwhile, immediately put lie to the notion that the Tetrarchy's territorial divisions were hard and fast by heading to Egypt to help quell an uprising on the Upper Nile, and he spent most of the next 2 years pacifying the Egyptian natives. While he was engaged in Egypt, events in Sassanid Persia hinted at what Galerius's next assignment would be. In 293, the Persian king Bahram II died, leaving the throne to his young son, Bahram III. But just a few months later, Bahram III would be deposed by another of Shapur's sons, a man named Narses, who despised his weak-willed brother and nephew, and planned to reintroduce the martial vigor of Ardashir and Shapur. In 295, Narses broke the eternal peace that had been established with Rome in 287 by invading Armenia and seizing the territories that had been ceded by Bahram in his negotiations with Diocletian. Conflict between the two great empires was now inevitable, and Diocletian called Galerius to Antioch to begin preparations for war. Back in the west, meanwhile, Constantius faced the question that had basically broken Maximian. How do we retake Britain? Now, the new Caesar had some ideas as to how to run a better invasion than Maximian, and when it finally came time to take back the island, Constantius did run a much more strategically sound campaign. But the real problem, the big problem, was Carausius himself. The self-proclaimed Augustus of Britain and Northern Gaul was no dummy, and he was no tyrant. By all accounts, he was a sound administrator, a savvy negotiator, a charismatic leader, and an excellent soldier. He was essentially everything that you would want in an emperor, and the citizens of his domains were highly conscious of that fact. The merchants loved him because he kept trade flourishing, his Frankish allies loved him because they were treated almost as equal partners, the legions loved him because he maintained high currency standards and was always on time with pay, and the general population loved him because he protected them from marauders and pirates. Carausius, much like Postumus in the Gallic Empire, was a capable leader, leading capably. There was no reason for anyone to wish him ill will. So, when Constantius was working up his invasion plans then, he could pretty much bank on the fact that there were plans for him. This was going to be an invasion of enemy territory in almost every sense of the word. And they had a better navy than he did, and their coastlines were fortified, and the British legions were well paid and well supplied. There was a reason Maximian had failed so completely, and it wasn't just that Maximian had screwed it all up. The recapture of Britain was a really, really hard assignment. Next week, we will see the Empire at war on two fronts. In the east, Galerius will indeed be called upon to lead a counterattack against a resurgent Sassanid Empire. And though in the end he will avenge the memory of Valerian, at first, like so many Roman wars, things did not go well at all. In the west, however, things will go a bit better, as Constantius will carefully and methodically isolate Carausius by leading a brilliant little campaign against the Franks on the mainland. Then, he will be given the greatest gift of all, as Carausius, like Postumus and Odenathus before him, will fall victim to an assassination plot that will leave Britain wide open for reconquest, and allow Constantius to style himself the restorer of eternal light. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 124, The Tetrarchs at War. We left off last week with our two newly appointed junior emperors, Constantius and Galerius, ready to begin the wars they had been assigned by their senior colleagues. In the north, Constantius was making final preparations for his invasion of Britain, while in the east, Galerius outlined his strategy for a punitive expedition against the Sassanids, who had recently broken their treaty with Rome by invading Armenia. For the moment, it looked like Constantius had drawn the short straw, forced to fight fellow Romans in an attempt to retake a nearly impregnable island that had thus far proved to be an impossible nut to crack. Galerius, on the other hand, got to fight Persians, and in addition to the riches and glory that usually came with campaigns in the east, Galerius also stood to be the man who finally avenged the long unavenged capture of Valerian. Constantius's assignment was hard and unglamorous. Galerius's was, well, not easy, but certainly not as hard, and it was most likely going to prove 10 times as glamorous. But despite the relative difficulties of their respective wars, it would shortly be Constantius